Hello, and welcome to our Mastering Scribe Online webinar series, where today's topic is going to be all about event maps. My name is Rich Radaci, Training Manager here at Scribe Software. Now, before we get started in the webinar today, I would like to first discuss some webinar guidelines. The first one is the incoming audio lines of this webinar will be muted. Now, you'll be able to hear us, however, we will not be able to hear you. Any webinar content-related questions that you may have can be typed into the questions section of your webinar panel. Your questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Now, please provide adequate detail in your questions regarding the content that raised your particular question. This will better serve us in answering your questions. The second one is this webinar is going to be recorded and posted within 48 hours on our website for subsequent reviewing. All attendees today will receive a post-webinar email follow-up providing access to it. And the third one is, should you encounter any webinar-related anomalies, I'd ask you to navigate to support via the help option in the banner of your webinar panel. Okay, now joining me today for an encore appearance and to once again share in his vast integration experience is Jeff Levetin, a solution engineer here at Scribe Software. Welcome back, Jeff, and thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Rich.
Great. So in today's webinar, I wanted to share with our listeners an important feature set that's available within Scribe Online, and that being event maps. Now, what are they? How are they used? How do they work? And how do you build one? Now, drawing on your expertise and assistance, Jeff, I thought we could begin with our defined webinar objectives and then deliver a comprehensive analysis into the details of event maps. Does that sound like a good place to start?
Sounds like a plan, Rich. Okay. Let's look at the objectives for this webinar.
Great.
Okay, so we want to cover event maps within Scribe Online. It's important to get a clear understanding of what they are. We want to go over what the specific use cases are for event maps. There's more than you might initially think. We also want to compare and contrast the two types of event maps that Scribe offers. We have two different ways to access them. We want to go over what the differences are and the similarities between the two. Also want to provide an architectural details of how Scribe processes the event so you can understand that at a deeper level. We're going to walk through some examples of how to build event maps, and we're going to run a few maps so you can see what they look like in action.
Great. With these defined objectives, Jeff, I'm sure that our listeners today will acquire a comprehensive understanding and appreciation of what event maps are and what they can certainly do for you.
Exactly. So what we want to start off with is what a high-level workflow for an event looks like. And this is typical for your modern systems with REST calls and REST endpoints. So the event starts in a system that's going to be external to Scribe Online. So there's some outside system that's going to make a call to Scribe Online via the HTTPS request. What's going to happen in that is the data will be included in the body of that request. That request is usually formatted in JSON, although we can handle XML or other payload formats. And the URL is going to be pointing to endpoint.scribesoft.com is the base URL, and then the other parts of that, as you can see on the screen, are specific to your particular organization, your particular map, and part of that URL is the security that points to your particular organization. So then Scribe receives the request, it checks the security settings for your organization to make sure that you're able to receive it from that IP address. It extracts the data from that payload, and then it executes the appropriate map depending upon what the URL says.
So Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're talking about here really is an alternate way to execute the running of a Scribe Online map. Now this is up and above a typical Scribe Online Integration Services, IS, map, which is usually scheduled to run based on a defined frequency or executed to run on demand. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. And this is a different way to both trigger a map and get the data for that particular map.
Got it.
In integration services, the trigger comes from within Scribe, like you said, either scheduled or on demand, and then it will reach out to an endpoint, query the data, pull that in, and use that to run the map, whereas events are really based upon that REST call.
Good, okay.
So what are some of the reasons you'd want to use event maps? Well, we break it down into three general areas of use cases for the event maps. The first one is probably the most common, the one you'd be most familiar with, and that's to process transactions in real time. So what happens is the message data is used to update the endpoint. That means that the data that you're getting is in the message itself, and that data is going to be passed through to some other endpoint, and you're going to update the data in that other endpoint. What are some examples of this? Well, very common examples would be someone on a website submits a contact form on their corporate website, and you want to create a lead in CRM. So in that case, the website would reach out to Scribe, call the event map, and then that event map would update your CRM system. Another common example is if you change an account record in Salesforce, that would trigger an outbound message, and that could update a target system. So in either of those cases, you're using Scribe to capture those events and then push that data to permanently update another system. The second common way to use it is in a request reply situation. And what you're doing is you're using the event map to retrieve data in real time. Okay? You're not actually updating the permanent state of any system, you're not updating a database. What you're doing is using Scribe to retrieve data from one of your endpoints and then return it back to the calling system. So in this case, the message data that comes in is used as a query, and that query is used to query the endpoint and pull data from it. An example of that would be an Amazon Echo Skill returns number of emergency support cases, and in our resources at our dev portal at Scribe Online, you can see some examples of what we do with that. Third way you can trigger an event map, and this one is probably the least common, but we want to be sure you understand the different ways you can use it, is you can use an event map to trigger another map to run in real time. What happens in this case is the message itself is coming in, and that's going to act as a trigger, and it may or may not contain data that is used in the operation of that map. Then the event map will run its own process. It'll process data by querying and updating a variety of endpoints within Scribe, because in any map you can have any number of endpoints. An example of this would be, say at the end of a large deduping batch process in your system, you want CRM to update leads to a marketing system. And in that case, you could have a process call the Scribe event map, and that could query the different endpoints and move the data to permanently update one of those target databases. So when we're talking about the different types of event maps that we have, there are message and request reply maps, and each of these different use cases lends itself to one of those different types of maps.
This is great information, Jeff. Having Scribe Online to be the receiver of external incoming requests versus making external inquiries offers tremendous value in regards to both efficiency and performance.
That's true. And one thing about the performance is that with a request reply map, you can, in some cases, limit the number of calls you have to your Salesforce API, and that can reduce the overall number of API hits that you're using. And for retrieving data in real time, that case, you're not necessarily forced to store data in a target system. You can just pull it on demand, and that can save storage space as well as processing for those normal type of integrations.
Makes sense, yeah.
Okay, so when we're talking about event maps within Scribe Online, there are two different types. We call them messaging and request reply. Now they're similar, but they're different. So in an event map, the application is going to send a message to the endpoint URL, endpoint.scribesoft.com, and we've seen that URL also contains the security information and the information needed to point to a particular map. When that event is called, the message is going to be written to the Scribe Online database in the cloud. That's a cloud table we have that will store that message in the database until it's processed. Immediately, the Scribe web service will send back a 200 response to the calling application. So for instance, that Salesforce making a message call to Scribe Online, it's going to send that, you're going to get that response immediately back as a 200 reply on that. And that's to signal that the message was successfully sent, successfully received, and now the calling application is done with that particular message. And this is the part that makes the event messages asynchronous. The call is made, Scribe receives it, quickly sends back the response, and then now Scribe is going to take over the processing of that, and the calling application is done with its part. So then the agent that is going to run the map it gets notified via the service bus, via our cloud, and that is going to start off the process of running the map. After that notification via the service bus, the agent is going to query the cloud database, and it's going to pull that message down to its own memory in the agent, and then it's going to run the specific map that was indicated in that initial URL call. When the map is done, it sends an execution history back to the cloud, which indicates that the map run was successful, and then that at some point in the future, the message that was stored in our database, it will be deleted. So it marks it for deletion, and then at some point in the future, it will clear that out of the database in the cloud. So that message that was sent originally is not permanently stored in Scribe Online. It's only temporarily stored as long as it needs to be in order to process the message. So again, the call is made, Scribe receives it, stores it in the database, sends an acknowledgement, then it spins up the machinery to run the right map. The map is run however long it takes, and then that execution history shows up in Scribe Online through your panel. Okay?
Yeah, that's a good visual as to how that all comes together.
Yeah. Now the request reply is very similar to that, except that the main difference is that when the calling application makes that request, it leaves open the HTTP request expecting a reply of data to come back through. So in this case, it's a synchronous call. The mechanism is very similar, and we'll go over that. Same exact thing happens. The external application makes a call to the Scribe endpoint. Scribe writes that data up to the cloud. The agent gets notified via the service bus, and the agent will pull the information, send the JSON to the map, and then the map will build a JSON reply. So the agent gets the data via the service bus, runs the map, and in this case, the map now is going to build its own JSON reply, which is going to get sent back up to the original calling application. Right? And the same exact thing happens at some point. That message will be marked for deletion after it's been processed. But the key point here is that that channel is kept open. The service bus sends that back to the calling agent, and then the original application that sends it gets that JSON back, and it can use it and process it. The main thing to remember in that is it's an asynchronous call, and that there's a timeout of a couple minutes if the job isn't fully processed. So that's the difference between the event and the request reply in the two different operations in which Scribe handles them.
So Jeff, just for those that may not be familiar with event messaging and request reply maps, you spoke about this URL endpoint. Can you give our listeners an idea as to where's that generated? Give them an idea how does that come about, that URL?
That's a good question. So when you create the event map or when you create the message map or the request reply map, once you drag that first block into your map and you save it, Scribe automatically generates that URL for you in the map, and you can cut and paste that into your calling application. So that's generated for you. It's composed of a key and the map name, and all that is built for you, and you just cut and paste it into your application.
And that's unique to every event map that you would create within Scribe Online.
It is unique to every event map within Scribe Online. Here's something else to think about too. So when you're creating your event maps, the first thing you want to do is make a solution to hold your event maps. So in an integration solution, all of the maps that are set to run will run in order. But in an event solution, all those maps are independent. Really, the event solution is just a holder. It's a placeholder for a different type of solution. And each of those maps runs independently. It has its own URL. When the application calls it, it runs that specific map, and only one map is run. Just a little difference between the integration and the event solutions. Want to be sure people understood that difference.
Okay, so Jeff, you think maybe after you gave this clear description as to how this all comes together, can you maybe share with our listeners a little bit about what they look like, these maps, as well as maybe how they work?
Sure. Why don't we bring up an example now in Scribe Online,
and
we can review a couple maps here. Okay, so we have the three different examples of the different types of event maps. In this case, we have a message map, which is expecting a message coming in from Salesforce, and the goal for this is to update a MySQL database. So what happens in Salesforce is it's configured for a workflow to call a message anytime someone changes an account, and then when that account is changed, it's going to go through the typical process we see, typical pattern in Scribe Online, look up in the target system, and then update or create the record accordingly. So if we look at what the block looks like here in the wait for message, we select the account, and at that point it knows about all the fields that are in that account object because it's built into the message connector itself. Taking a step back, we want to talk about another difference between the message maps and request reply maps. In a message map, the connector itself is aware of what the schema is for the incoming message. So in this case, what we do is we select the account object, we do the lookup on the company, and once we do lookup on the company and we're in our lookup criteria here, we can see we go into Scribe Online and see the scope, and all the fields in the account are available here in the formula editor. It is important to remember with message maps that the calling application has to populate all of these fields. This is a template that's expecting the JSON to come in as it's being called from Salesforce, and actually I think Salesforce is sending us XML in this case. But the important thing to remember is that when you are building your message from your outbound system, and in this case it's Salesforce, you want to be sure that all those fields that you're going to use in your map are actually populated in that outbound message. So that way when you go to use your map and pull the data in, it's actually in the actual message. So in this case, you can see that the account object has the fields, and what we're doing is we're using this the account ID field to do a lookup against the company object, which is a little sample database we put together for training purposes. And then the typical pattern of if it does exist, we're going to update it. Otherwise, we're going to create the company, and then we're going to exit the map. So what's good to remember here is that although the map exit, there is no response returned within the map. The response was returned initially when the message was received. All right? So then we can, here, head over to Salesforce, and we head to the accounts page, show all the accounts, and we can edit this one, and we can say, all right. And now what's going to happen is that's going to call the Scribe map. We can see that's happening in progress right here. So Salesforce saw that there was a change to that account record. It called the workflow to send the information over to Scribe via the URL that is in the map, and then it processes the record and it updates MySQL accordingly. I think we can head over to MySQL and.
So to be clear, the requirements on the Salesforce side, specifically for this use case that you're sharing with us, the workflow has to be set up within Salesforce, defining, okay, what is the trigger mechanism here? And then also, in addition to that, you need to define the outbound message. So the trigger fires, the workflow fires, it creates the XML message, and it then pushes it out to that URL endpoint that you had mentioned. Is made available once you create the first block within your event map.
Exactly.
Okay.
And as you can see, it updated it here in MySQL. The name of the company was changed to Agibu Test. And that takes it from start to finish. Salesforce makes the call, as we talked about configuring. Scribe picks it up and then updates the MySQL database accordingly, and then we can see it in the actual endpoint there.
Right, so we're using MySQL as a target in this particular instance, but we can really use any connector that we support.
And that's a very good point too. Once you're in the event map, just like in any Scribe map, you can pull in any of your other endpoints. So you can update any of the endpoints that you have access to. You can update multiple endpoints within a single map. Within a request reply map, you can query multiple endpoints and pull data from a variety of different sources. So in that case, it's powerful in two ways. One, that you can use it to update multiple sources, and two, you can pull data from multiple sources in a request reply. All right, so it is good to remember that once you are in Scribe and you have access to all of your all of your endpoints that you would normally have access to within your map.
Right, okay.
Right. Okay. So that's the first example where we're using an event map to update a system in real time. Now we want to look at a different example where we're using a request reply to pull data from an endpoint. And in this case, we're going to be pulling the data from MySQL. What we want to do is look at the wait for request block here, which is how you build your request reply map. And we'll look at this block and show you how that looks. So in the previous example, we selected an entity that gave us what the schema was. But in request reply map, the difference is that you build the incoming JSON message yourself. So what you do here is you enter field by field what you're expecting to be coming in the inbound JSON message, and then you use that in your map further down. So in this case, what we're doing is we're expecting an email address to come in. We're going to look up a lead based upon that email address, all right? And then we're going to build a reply which includes the lead data as well as tickets for that particular lead. All right? So the reply here is going to be the parent object. We're going to call it lead, and we're going to populate it with fields that come from the company record for the lead record over in our MySQL database. And as you can see, it's the basic type of information: first name, last name, email, etc. And then what we do is use the scribe function to fetch the tickets and loop through them. And as we loop through, each ticket is going to be built as a child object and attached to the parent lead object. And you can see your basic information in your ticket option here, description, ticket name, etc., etc.
So let me just ask you a question. So for those applications that, let's say, do not support the automation like a Salesforce or a Microsoft Dynamics 365, to be able to push out a XML or a JSON payload, you could use this as a substitute, right?
Exactly.
I mean, especially if you have like a homegrown application.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could do it then. Okay.
This is a way to applications that don't have incoming REST APIs to build one and then use Scribe as the intermediary to update those particular endpoints.
Okay.
All right, so let's head over to Postman and see what that looks like when we make that call. So in this case, we're going to use Postman to call the endpoint at scribesoft.com. We're going to send over the email address, and that email address is going to be used to make a query to the endpoints and then pull that data back. So in this case, we're going to make that send. And as you can see, it keeps the connection open, and then it sends the data back via the JSON that comes out of the calling map. And you have the lead information as well as several tickets that came over as children to that particular lead. Okay, so that's how a request reply map works. Now we want to show you how to use an event map to trigger a map run. And in this case, we're going to also use Postman to test it. And let's look at what that map does when we call it. So in this case, we have a message that's called, and what it does is, all it does is trigger a map run where we query MySQL, we fetch the contacts from MySQL, and we upsert the contacts to Salesforce. So in this case, we're just using it to trigger the map run. We're going to fetch all of the contacts out of our MySQL database. We're going to upsert the contacts to Salesforce as a target. So in this case, all that this map is doing is using it as a trigger to run what's essentially an integration services map. Okay? We can also see how that looks with Postman when we make that call. We'll head over to that trigger message map. And in this case, the body of the message has a couple fields. Those fields aren't really necessary, but they're just there in case we actually wanted to use them. Now when we make the request here, okay, we send it. Notice how the 200 response comes back immediately from Scribe Online, and that closes the window, that closes the connection in the calling application. And now we head over to Scribe, and we can see that the message will be processed asynchronously. So we wait here. We'll see that now the message is actually being run by Scribe. That event is going on asynchronously in the background, and we've made a call which will run all on its own. And then once it's finished, it'll report that execution history back up to the cloud, and then we'll see that in our panel right here.
Okay, well, Jeff, this was very, very interesting, especially knowing that you do have the options of dealing with data in a source system that maybe does not have that automation built in to be able to push out an XML or a JSON message. And you do have these functions, or event maps, if you will, that would allow you to go ahead and capture that, as long as you build that initial template so as to support the population of that template with the data that's coming from the source system.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, well, Jeff, thank you very much for your time and contribution today. So let's go ahead and close this off today. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of Scribe Software, Jeff Levetin and myself, we both thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Don't forget to join us once again for our next monthly webinar in this Mastering Scribe Online series, where you too can become a master of Scribe Online. Thank you again, Jeff.
Thanks, Rich. Talk to you soon.